What?
Only takes one nail to hang up a picture.
What?
Only takes one nail to hang up a picture.
Does anybody have a Tanya?
Recent Tanya's. You have it tonight?
I would assume to be a Tanya in this building.
Probably is one.
Right on this wall over here.
Yeah.
If you take it off there, it'll be off the wall.
Let me go to my room to get mine. Let me go to my room to get mine.
Sure.
I think that's the time from here.
I'm going to begin the class. Okay. Hi. So we'll start with how my week began, actually. Somebody called me on Sunday, a frum Jew, actually, and he asked me a question, and I told him it's in Tanya, actually. The Alter Rebbe quotes it in Tanya, the concept of that Hashem created the world and did not let it go, but He still constantly creates it, right? You're all familiar with that, Tanya. Well, what's interesting about it, he asked me, is there a quote in the Tanakh anywhere that can back this statement up, that it's a falsehood? And I said, I'm sure there is. And I was actually surprised when I looked in Tanya, and there's no quote mentioned. It just says as a matter of fact, and just gives proofs to it. And I'm not disputing the Alter Rebbe, I'm not going there, that's not what I'm here for. But rather, they used to have a slogan for the yellow pages, that if it's out there, it's in there. Similarly, if it's out there, it's in the Tanakh. So obviously, the Mishnah that says, Hafachba v'afachba d'chulaba, right? Everything is in Torah. So there has to be a reference to it in our Tanakh. Well, lo and behold, our prophet Yecheskel has two quotes for it. One is in Ches Yud Beis 8:12.
Repeat what he said?
But who said?
What we're looking at?
Well, we're trying to find out, where does it say anywhere that Hashem has not let go of the world? He created the world, maybe He left. Maybe He just let it for nature or us to do whatever we have to do. So there's a question: is there a reference in the Tanakh anywhere? So we'll look in chapter 8, verse 12, and I'll read it in English. Then he said to me, now I don't know if anybody's familiar, but Yecheskel was always referred to as by Hashem as the Son of Man. That's what he's called, Ben Adam, right? So now, in verse 12, he says like this. Then he said to me, have you seen, O Son of Man, what the elders of the house of Israel do in the darkness? Each man in his paved rooms? For they say, Hashem does not see us, and Hashem has forsaken the land, quote unquote. Okay? So obviously that statement is saying that what?
Kohanim were doing a very good job right before we destroyed Beit HaMikdash, right before Hashem.
Correct. But I'm saying, what is this reference telling us in terms of whether Hashem has left the earth, world, and land or not? It's clear that He's there. You can't run away from Him. Then we'll look at the next chapter, chapter 9, verse 9. Again, let's look in English. Then he said to me, the iniquity of the house of Israel and Judah is very, very great. The land has been filled with bloodshed, and the city has been filled with injustice. For they have said, quote, Hashem has forsaken the land, and Hashem does not see. Again, an obvious quote to disprove this concept, even to fathom even this thought that Hashem has left the earth for any moment, God forbid, is unfathomable. So that's how my week began, actually. But then as the week went on, there was more to the story, but we'll leave that part out. We'll go back to what we were doing the last several times, and that is looking at some of these pamphlets or letters that these missionaries give out. Okay, so we'll look into a thought about King David, because King David is an important factor in our life, and they want to equate, or not equate, but rather assume that whoever is this King David applies to their man as the Messiah, etc., etc. Well, let's look at who King David was, what the Tanakh tells us about who King David was, and where he comes from, and let's explore that for a little bit. So now we're going to go to the book of Micha, chapter 5. Okay. Chapter 5. We'll start at the beginning of chapter 5. And I'm going to look in the King James book how they translate these verses. I'm going to show, like I did the last week, something very interesting. Okay, so let's look at the first verse. That's all we need is the first verse. Ve'ata Bethlehem Ephrata, you are too small to be among the thousands of Judah, but from you someone will emerge from me to be a ruler over Israel, and his origins will be from early times, from days of old. Okay? Who's this referring to? Can anybody guess? Okay. King David. Absolutely. Where does David come from? Bethlehem. You say that every day, every Friday night. Right? In the Lechadodi. Right? Beis Halachmi. Karvel Nashi Ge'ala. Right? Who's that referring to? If not for King David. All right? So let's understand several things here. Now, obviously, anything referring to David, they're going to want to take it and use it for their man. Because after all, this is who is supposed to be the Messiah, quote unquote, son of David. So let's understand a little bit about who David is altogether, and what is this Bethlehem altogether? Where does this come from? Where does David come from? It comes from Bethlehem. Well, let's look at his origins. So, who was David's grandmother? Rus, very good. Where did she come from? Moab. She was a Moab, right? Now, if all you're going to have in front of you is the written Torah, right? There's a major problem we have here. What's the major problem? The major problem is that we have a verse in Deuteronomy, in Dvarim, that tells us that somebody that comes from Moab cannot come into the congregation of Israel, of God, right? Right? So we have a major problem here. Our Mashiach, our David, is coming from damaged goods, if I may say that, from a Moabite. So how does that happen? Although I'm going to take even further back, and it becomes even dirtier, actually. Who was the origin of Moab? Where was the origin of Moab? Lot's impregnating one of his daughters. Right?
Moab.
The older daughter.
From father.
From father. That's literally the word Moab means from father. Right. So if you really come to think of it, this is really kind of damaged goods. But let's not go as far as there, because obviously this was part of the original plan. Okay? But let's look at how can we allow for a Moabite to join the Jewish congregation. So we need a Gemara to tell us that when we say a Moabite may not join, it's only referring to the males of that country. And the reason for that is actually there's a verse that tells us about that. Why may a Moabite not come into our circles, into our congregation? Because they did not offer any food, water, bread and water for the Jews as they were passing by Moab. And the Gemara tells us that the women were not expected to give them the food. It was only the men that were expected to kind of be outspoken and offer food. And since they were the ones that didn't, so therefore it was only the male side of the family that was kind of shunned from this opportunity to join the Jewish community. And therefore, David's grandmother was able to join our nation. Hence, we can have a Moabite as our Mashiach. Okay? Now, so when we read this verse, it tells us that you are too small, talking about Bethlehem. Why? Because this Moabite is kind of a damaged goods. And that's why this verse refers to the fact that he is too small, Moab is, right? Bethlehem is. Right? Okay, it makes perfectly sense. Okay, now, do you think this is a good verse for King James or any of the other authors of the Bible? I don't think so. Too small? This is where their Messiah is supposed to come from. See, to us, we can live with that because we understand all the details of, yes, it's small because of the blemish of Moab, but on the other hand, we know the other side of the story where it's only about the men and not the women, and therefore it's acceptable. And it's not really as blemished as it can sound when you read the absolute Torah, Bible. Okay? But to them, they don't have an oral Torah. Therefore, it can't even make sense that a Moabite can join. Let's start with that. And secondly, the fact that this is the birthplace of this guy, of this David, how could they have it as being too small? Right? So it becomes a major problem for them. So let's look how they, in their book, and I'm going to read just this verse in Micha first, and then I'm going to go somewhere else with this in their book, because you'll see something very interesting happening. Okay? Now, they don't have the order the way we have it. And for good reason. Because they can't have certain people before other people, or right after the other people, because it can't be that this guy prophesied something and he knew something that the other guy didn't know, kind of. They have a problem with a lot of things. Like they have Chronicles right away. It's like one of the first, before Nehemiah, before all of these guys. I mean, it's like interesting. Because usually when you write a book, where would you put Chronicles? In the middle of a book? You would probably put it at the end of a book, no? Well, they find it a little different. And they put Chronicles before all the prophets, actually. Okay, so let's look at Micah. Okay, here's Micah. But they have it a little different order. Even the verses are not necessarily... The chapters might be the same, but the verses are not necessarily the same. So there, Micah 5, it's not verse 2 actually, but rather it's not verse 1, it's verse 2 actually. Okay? Let's read what it says here. But thou, Bethlehem, Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth unto me, that is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from of old, from everlasting. Now, does anybody know what the last words mimei kedem we had in the Hebrew verse of 5:1 of Micha? What does it say? Umoitzoisav mikedem mimei olam. Does mimei olam, literally, what does mimei olam mean? The translation of mimei olam. Does anybody know?
From the end of the world?
From days of old. From days of old. You say it every day in davening, several times. Right? Mimei, from days of old. Right? Well, their translation is from everlasting. Okay? What does everlasting imply? Only a God is everlasting. Right? So therefore, this from everlasting is a very critical word in their translation. But let's leave that alone for a moment. This book, actually, this version of the King James, is a study guide. So what's a study guide? We have Marmakaimus references. So they have references too. So let's look at the reference that they have for this verse in their books. So let's look at Matthew 2, because that's what he tells me to look at, Matthew 2. And you'll notice something very interesting, an interesting spin on the same verse. It's verse 5. It's actually a little further down. Okay, it's verse 6. And thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the princes of Judah. Did you see that in that verse that you had? No. Okay. But he's telling me that this verse is actually found in Micah 5:2. Which, well, I told you, there is Micah 5:2, we're 5:1. But it's the same verse. But and even in their book, 5:2 says, "But thou, Beth, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah." Which one is it? You are little or you're not little? Okay? But this is what they do when they have a little problem with what's going on with our story. Okay? And then he goes on to say, yeah. Okay. So that's what he does here in Micah 5. So when they'll tell you that it says in Micah that he came out of there, and you ask them, but isn't Bethlehem a damaged city? Say no. It says they are not the least. You'll show them your book, and they're not looking at your book, because even though they have that same Micah in their book, but according to Paul and Matthew, this book, the Old Testament, is old, and we vex it. You ever heard the expression vex? I'm not talking about the vecker that comes and wakes you up in the morning. Okay, he vexes you up in the morning? No, I'm not talking about that guy. Vex means, nobody knows English here?
Klala.
Huh?
Klala. A curse.
No?
Vex, like confused.
No? Anybody?
Like
You do away with it.
Yeah.
You do away with it. It's garbage. You throw it away. Okay? So this is what Paul says about the Old Testament. We have the new, so we vex the old. Okay? So why are you telling me, if Mr. Paul, or St. Paul, or whoever he is telling me that we vex the old, so why are all the missionaries coming around to me, giving me verses from the Old Testament, if we vex the old? And besides, let me ask you a question. If a person has an old car, an old junky car, and he keeps it on his lot, I'm sure you've seen that where people out in the country, they'll have an old car that they had, and the grandfather had, they keep it on the property land, somewhere in the landfill kind of, okay? And you bought yourself a new car. Do you ever refer to that old car as my old car? No, it's a piece of junk. Right? It's nothing. Except for one time. There is a case where you would refer to it as your old car. You know when? When you need parts out of it. So that's my old car. And that's exactly what our Old Testament is. It's that old car that we vex, we put in the landfill, and every once in a while, when we need something, when we can pull something out that can enhance our new car, quote unquote, all of a sudden there's value to it. Okay? Let's go a little deeper into the story. So, let's go to another one of their typical lines. Let's look at Hosea.
Do they see just the 5 books of Moses as the or the whole
Everything,
Tanakh?
the whole Old Testament.
They literally throw out Leviticus.
Well, you want to do Leviticus?
What?
You want to do Leviticus? That's a big one.
Leviticus, they practically throw it in the garbage besides for like 2 things. Like they
Well, let's look at Leviticus. Instead of Hosea, let's look at Leviticus. They have a big thing about sin and atonement. Okay? Now, I had a situation where, with one of my Bible study classes, the pastor over there was trying to understand the concept of sin and atonement. And she says that for an atonement, for any sin, you need an atonement. And how does one get an atonement? Let's look at their religion. Probably none of you know, or you shouldn't know. How does one get an atonement? Through the blood of a certain person, right? By believing in the cross, you get an atonement. Okay? Let me ask you something. How many people over here know how many sins is brought down in the book of Leviticus and the book of Vayikra that tells us that we need blood? No, if we need the blood of any person, no, not going there. How many sins is referred to in the book of Leviticus that one needs an atonement for? That one can get an atonement with a sacrifice. Let's go there. Can anybody guess?
36.
36. Okay, let's do football. Okay, 22. Hike. Okay, no, let's not go there. No. Anybody else? All right. In my book, it only says about one sin. It says v'nefesh kisechta bishkaga. It talks about a soul that sins accidentally, right? And if you want a reference to that, it's in Parshas Tzav. It's in Tzav or Vayikra, actually. It's actually in Vayikra. Here, 4:1, 4:2. Chapter Leviticus 4:2. Speak to the children of Israel, saying, when a person will sin unintentionally from among all the commandments of Hashem that may not be done,